Why can't they hit Michigan's entirely essential weed stores and numb out as their benevolent leader Gretchen solidifies her control over their lives? Why do they have to complain all the time? Saying unapproved things is racist. It inspires fear and hate. Stop it right now, you proles! How dare you!
How dare you!
Fire up a bowl and accept your fate.
These people are sick.
We spend much of the day speaking to highly informed officials in the U.S. government as well as seasoned specialists on China. Here's the picture that emerged from those conversations. First, many in the intelligence world with experience in China suspected right away that the story the Chinese government was telling about this virus was almost certainly a lie. The first indication of that was the torrent of obvious nonsense coming from official sources in Beijing. Now, initially, Chinese sources, you may remember this, claimed the virus had jumped from an obscure scaly animal called a pangolin, which was sold in the Wuhan wet market. But that explanation didn't make any sense. Wet markets are seafood markets. Pangolins are mammals, so for that matter are bats. So in the face of skepticism at this explanation, the Chinese then blamed Italian armed forces personnel, who it turns out had been near Wuhan a few months before for the Military World Games. That's an international sporting event. The Italians must have brought the virus to China, the Chinese said. When the Italian government complained about that, the Chinese shifted the blame to the U.S. military.
As you know, China tried to say at one point, maybe there's stuff now, that it was caused by American soldiers. That can't happen. It's not going to happen. Not as long as I'm president. It comes from China.
The American armed services and Western tourists must have infected Wuhan, the Chinese said. Meanwhile, as they were saying this, behind the scenes, Chinese officials were working frantically to destroy relevant evidence of where it actually came from. Doctors and journalists in Wuhan who raised uncomfortable questions about the virus disappeared. Some of them may have been murdered. At one point in January, scientists in Shanghai succeeded in sequencing the DNA from the virus. The information they gathered from that could have been crucial to researchers around the world who are trying to understand the virus and develop vaccines against it. In other words, the rest of us. But the Chinese government ordered that viral sample destroyed and the lab notes from that shredded. The scientists themselves were disciplined for daring to conduct this research, and their lab was shut down. The Chinese government then quarantined the entire city of Wuhan. Up to 5 million people fled. But apparently relatively few of them were allowed to travel to Beijing, the Chinese capital. Instead, they flew to Western cities around the world.
How dare you!
Now, to most in the United States, reactions to a crisis like this seem grotesque, really unimaginable. But to Mandarin speakers who followed China carefully and have for a long time, these were highly familiar moves. The first reflex of the Chinese government is always to lie in order to hide failure and avoid embarrassment. In 2003, for example, the Chinese government lied about the initial outbreak of SARS, another coronavirus. In July of 2011, 2 passenger trains traveling in opposite directions smashed into each other at high speed outside the Chinese city of Wenzhou. The trains collided on a railroad bridge. 4 cars derailed and tumbled to the ground below. Within hours, authorities arrived with backhoes. They pushed the passenger cars into a pit and began covering them with dirt. By some accounts, there were still survivors inside at the time, inside the passenger cars.
These people are sick.
In their initial statements, Chinese officials claimed that a lightning strike had caused that crash. They later conceded under pressure that it was sloppiness and shoddy construction that were to blame. Chinese media, meanwhile, were ordered to ignore the crash entirely except, quote, for positive news, or that news issued by authorities.
We choose truth over facts.
This was the template for China's official response to the Wuhan virus. From the early days of the outbreak, Chinese diplomats around the world insisted there was no chance whatsoever the virus had come from a lab. They sometimes insisted this even when no one had asked them, as if they were reading from a script. It soon became very obvious what was going on. English-language academic journals had raised for years questions about the safety standards in Wuhan bio-research labs. An article in Nature, for example, from 2017, noted that, quote, some scientists outside China worry about pathogens escaping from the facility. Classified State Department cables a year later voiced the same concerns. Chinese scientists themselves publicly discussed working with extremely dangerous pathogens in Wuhan. As of today, says someone in a position to know, there is, quote, almost unanimous agreement in the American intelligence gathering agencies that the virus currently destroying much of the world emerged from a lab in Wuhan.
Comes from China. Comes from China. It comes from China.
Almost unanimous. That's a phrase almost never used to describe any conclusion coming out of the intel community. Government officials in this country have believed that for some time now. They've been unable to interest our media or our epidemiologists in writing about it. In recent weeks, analysts from the CIA, the NSA, and others have briefed staff at the New York Times about the origins of this virus, but the newspaper has still not reported their findings. At the same time, and this may be directly related, China has been waging an unremitting propaganda war on the subject. Chinese officials have tried to squelch all conversations about who might be responsible for this pandemic by inflaming the political sensitivities and race guilt of American elites. Watch this clip from early last month as the spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry tries to dictate how American press outlets describe the virus.
Certain media say this coronavirus is a China virus. This is extremely irresponsible, and we firmly oppose that.
It comes from China.
Among the many ironies in what you just heard, even now, even today, the disease is widely referred to in China as the Wuhan virus. Our news outlets, meanwhile, almost always call it COVID-19. That term does not translate to Chinese. COVID-19 is the name devised by the World Health Organization back in January under influence from Chinese leaders who were anxious to deflect responsibility for it.
How dare you?
Once they succeeded in removing any hint of origin from the name of the virus, the Chinese government launched a campaign to tar anyone who mentioned Wuhan as a dangerous racist. Quote, racism is not the right tool to cover your own incompetence, lectured Chinese state media when President Trump referred to the Wuhan virus. American media parroted that line almost precisely, as no doubt the Chinese expected they would.
The president referred to the coronavirus as a, quote, foreign virus. And I think it's going to it's going to come across to a lot of Americans as smacking of xenophobia.
Xenophobic wartime Trump, where he thinks the only path now is to basically declare the virus public enemy number one, paint it in somewhat racist terms.
The xenophobia and the racism in outbreak is such a common thing, and it is incredibly dangerous. It is problematic, and it is scary, and I just really want to call that out.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why.
Fools. But not a major victory for the Chinese government. Media outlets are relatively easy to corrupt given the low level of sophistication of the people who work there. The Chinese government had bolder aims than that. The Chinese instructed their employees and assets in the United States to exert influence on elected officials. For example, according to an informed U.S. government official, quote, Beijing has instructed diplomats in their consulate in San Francisco to work with American state and local officials and members of Congress to push back against anyone who gets too far out on blaming China for this. That's what they're doing. Apparently, it's working. Here's Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy on CNN earlier this week.
The reason that we're in the crisis that we are today is not because of anything that China did, is not because of anything the WHO did, it's because of what this president did.
These people are sick.
It's not because of anything China did. Other members of Congress voiced similar views, often in eerily similar language. Barbara Lee of California, long considered a strongly pro-China voice, tweeted this to the president, quote, diseases don't have nationalities. China isn't to blame for you fumbling this crisis, end quote. On March 12th, Congresswoman Judy Chu of Los Angeles wrote this, quote, China didn't unleash anything. A virus spread as viruses do. Blaming China and insisting on calling this the Wuhan virus, even though every medical expert said not to, is putting people's lives in danger. Stop politicizing this and put people first. Just the week before Chu wrote that, on March 6th, A man called Zhang Ping, who runs the Chinese consulate in Los Angeles, met with Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti about the American response to coronavirus. And he tweeted about it that day. He said this, quote, "Looking forward to working closely with the city of Los Angeles to address this common public health challenge and develop closer ties between our cities and peoples," end quote. Now, we have no idea what Ping and Garcetti talked about in that meeting that day. It would be interesting to know. We reached out today to a number of California lawmakers with a history of closeness to China. That includes senior Senator Dianne Feinstein, who once employed a Chinese spy, to see if they have spoken to Chinese officials recently. None of them responded to our calls.
Shame on you.
But it's not just happening in California. According to a study and a story reported by National Review, the head of the state senate in Wisconsin recently received multiple emails from the wife of the Chinese consul general in Chicago. She asked him to propose a resolution praising China for its handling of the Wuhan virus outbreak.
These people are sick.
The entire story of how the government of China has successfully shaped our understanding of this pandemic, of the virus, as well as our response to it, may take years to tell. And in fact, it may never fully be told at all. We promise to do our best on this show. But it is clear how China sees this pandemic. China doesn't see this simply or even primarily as a public health disaster in which thousands are dying. China sees this as part of a larger geopolitical struggle for control of the world. Most Americans still don't perceive that or understand the profound gravity of the stakes involved. But how could they? Our leaders have lied to us about it for years. Brian Dean Wright is a Democrat and a former CIA officer. We're happy to have him tonight. Brian, thanks a lot for coming on. It's striking to me, and it's a matter of public record, that the Chinese government is attempting to leverage its relations with our elected officials to control how we talk about a virus they unleashed on the world. How do you feel when you hear that?
How can anybody not feel outraged? You know, we all know, we've all lived in a country for the past 30 years that has been sold out to the Chinese government. We were promised in the late 1990s that, hey, China goes in the WTO and we'll all benefit. That didn't take place. We've watched our intellectual property be stolen for 30 years. And now we watch some of our elected leaders, I'm sorry to say, many of them on my side of the aisle, capitulate to the Chinese government once again. I mean, here we are, 30 years and we've learned nothing. So I'm outraged. It makes me incredibly angry.
It seems like a pretty straightforward question. So we reached out to Senator Feinstein and a number of other elected officials today and asked, have you had contact recently since the outbreak with Chinese officials? And not a single one responded. What do you think we should infer from that?
I think that they're nervous. I think there are a bunch of people who, because they're either useful idiots or they have some degree of knowledge and relationships behind the scenes with the Chinese government. Some of them, in fact, could be Chinese agents of the actual MSS, their intelligence service, God forbid. They're nervous, and they know that if nothing else, the party has, certainly for the past 3 months, doubled down on their pro-China rhetoric. And if the U.S. intelligence community, in collecting this information, not only the information that we know through our CIA and NSA and others, but also reaching out to our allies, places like the Australians and the South Koreans and Japanese, if we know with a high degree of confidence the Chinese, in fact, released this virus accidentally or otherwise and caused this pandemic, and yet the Democratic Party and its leaders have been supportive of the regime, parroting their talking points. Well, it was not only just the geopolitical fallout around the country, but what's the political fallout, especially in 2020, as the November election happened. So that's why I suspect you're not hearing much. We've got a lot of very nervous folks in the Democratic Party.
I suspect that's right. You always forget there's an election going on as well. Brian D. Wright, great to see you tonight. Thank you for that.
You bet.
Last year, I received an invitation to an event that promised to be, quote, an occasion for exclusive deal-making. It said, quote, the opportunities for mutually beneficial economic development between China and our individual states are tremendous, end of quote. Deal-making sounds like it might have come from President Trump. but the invitation was actually from a former governor. I was being invited to the U.S.-China Governors Collaboration Summit. It was an event co-hosted by the National Governors Association and something called the Chinese People's Association for Friendship and Foreign Countries. Sounds pretty harmless. What the invitation did not say is that the group I just mentioned, is the public face of the Chinese Communist Party's official foreign influence agency, the United Front Work Department. Now, I was lucky. I was familiar with that organization from my time as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, but it got me thinking, how many of you made the link between that group and Chinese Communist Party officials? What if you made a new friend while you were at that event? What if your new friend asked you for introductions to other politically connected and powerful people? What if your new friend offered to invest big money in your state, perhaps in your pension, in industries sensitive to our national security? These aren't hypotheticals. These scenarios are all too true, and they impact American foreign policy significantly. Indeed, last year, a Chinese government-backed think tank in Beijing produced a report that assessed all 50 of America's governors on their attitudes towards China. They labeled each of you friendly, hardline, or ambiguous. I'll let you decide where you think you belong. Someone in China already has. Many of you, indeed, in that report are referenced by name. So here's the lesson. The lesson is that competition with China is not just a federal issue. It's why I wanted to be here today, Governor Hogan. It's happening in your states with consequences for our foreign policy, for the citizens that reside in your states, and indeed for each of you. And in fact, whether you're viewed by the CCP as friendly or hardline, know that it's working you. Know that it's working the team around you. Competition with China is happening inside of your state, and it affects our capacity to perform America's vital national security functions.
How dare you!
How dare you!
Fire up a bowl and accept your fate.